everyone. Welcome to a webinar hosted by the Cloud Standards Customer Council, Cloud Security Standards, What to Expect and What to Negotiate. My name is Tracy Berardi. I am Program Manager of the CSCC. Thanks for joining us today. I'm joined by my colleagues from the CSCC who helped to write this great deliverable, Mr. Claude Bourgeois, Principal at Sebe IT and Knowledge Management, and Energy Domain Consultant with the OMG, Mr. Mike Edwards, Cloud Computing Standards Expert and Bluemix PaaS Evangelist at IBM, and Mr. Alexander Tumashov, IT Cloud and Server Integration Manager at Schlumberger. Now, Mike, Claude, and Alex helped to write this Security Standards Guide with a team of other folks. We couldn't have everyone on the call today, but they're here in spirit, and we thank them all for contributing to this guide. If you're new to the Cloud Standards Customer Council, I'm just going to take a moment to tell you about who we are, what we do. The CSCC is a nonprofit organization managed by the Object Management Group, and we work with standards bodies, open source groups, and cloud end users, cloud customers, to publish vendor-neutral guides on important cloud topics such as security, interoperability, portability, the content of cloud SLAs, etc. And our work helps to influence standards of practice by highlighting customer requirements, use cases, and best practices. So we've published a significant number of deliverables you can see on the screen since our inception in 2011. This year, we've written a practical guide to hybrid cloud computing. We've updated our guide on public cloud service agreements, and we continue to build out our series of cloud reference architectures, most recently writing about how to support IoT, Internet of Things, using cloud computing, and how to support e-commerce solutions using cloud computing. And we encourage you to visit our website to read this material and consider joining. It's a free membership, and you can network with others working on similar projects and contribute to future papers if you so choose. So in the BrightTalk platform here, there's an Attachments tab. That's where you can download a PDF of today's presentation. We also have a direct link to the Cloud Standards Security Standards Guide in its entirety that we published in late August. So now let's go ahead and dig into version 2.0 of Cloud Security Standards. I'm going to hand over to Claude. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy, for this introduction. For the few people who joined after the presentation started, Tracy had given us a little bit of an organizational overview, and you can download the slides from the attachment tab, and therefore you won't have missed anything. But we're now plunging into what is actually the content of the recommendations made by the Cloud Standards Customer Council in this version 2 of this paper. We are usually revising all our documents every 3 years at this point because we consider that the speed of evolution of the cloud market and the cloud technology requires this. In this case, the cloud landscape in terms of security has changed significantly in the past 3 years, both in terms of awareness of the challenges and the technologies and the evolution of the standards in particular, which is the scope of this paper. The regulations around the world relating to personally identifiable information, or PII, has evolved, and in particular in the European Union, which has some of the strictest rules around the world, the new regulation imposes more constraints on cloud providers when they hold data related to European Union citizens. Standards have become more adopted, and then there's work that we will refer to repeatedly about standards called ISO IEC 27017 and 18. The whole 27000 series is about security of information, and those two standards and their associated certifications are specifically about the cloud. So all that justified that we revise the paper. We start by talking about why cloud security standards are beneficial to the users of the cloud. Remember, the CSCC represents and advocates for the customers of the cloud, although, of course, we maintain a collaborative relationship with the providers and try to educate them, too, about what's important to the customers. Standards, if followed, will promote the interoperability between various cloud offerings and allow more flexibility in moving from cloud vendor to cloud vendor. They will facilitate hybrid cloud computing in case a customer is simultaneously using multiple clouds for various reasons, as well as continuing to use their own on-premises systems. So security needs to span these multiple clouds. They represent an assurance that a cloud provider is implementing best practices contained in those standards, and they also allow an easier process of comparing solutions when you as a customer are selecting among multiple cloud providers. You can use their level of obedience, awareness, and certification to some of these standards to evaluate which provider might be more secure than another. And if you are implementing yourself or requiring your provider to implement a certain standard, that will allow you to more easily be compliant with laws and regulations of the jurisdiction or the customers or the sector in which you work. So these are all the upsides of doing this. So we have here a sort of higher level view of the current landscape of cloud standards, and basically the general message is that cloud security standards are maturing. 3 years ago, there were not that many, or they were at the draft level being discussed, etc. Now we have multiple, both international standards like those of ISO and standards of various industry bodies and various governments. In a sense, that proliferation is in itself an issue. That is why we have a necessity for this paper, is to help you make sense of this fairly complicated landscape. You need to consider different standards, both formal and industry standards. There are general IT security standards, like the initial ones in the ISO 27000 series and others that, of course, have an implication on cloud computing. They may just become a little bit more complicated to implement in a cloud context, and the cloud service providers should, of course, support them. They're the foundation. And then customers should insist on certifications against those providers. So we will come back in much more detail to these various points. And we have 3 boxes at the bottom of this slide that gives example that give examples of 3 types of standards that you can find. You have those that are essentially advisory. They provide good classification, taxonomies, and advice, but they have some sort of flexibility. They represent a menu of things that you can do, and you have examples listed at the bottom of that box. You have frameworks that define policies, control, etc. They're much more, if you wish, about a security architecture. And then you have specifications that are much more detailed, much more technical. They define some application programming interfaces or some web services, some markup languages, some encodings and encryption standards. And again, the examples are here on the right-hand side. So this provides, if you wish, the overall view of what exists out there, and we're going to yeah, I and my colleagues are going to tell you a little bit more about some of these. We follow in this paper about what's important and what to negotiate and what to discuss in standards. We follow the same 10 steps we have in a companion paper of the CSCC, which was our first paper on security, called Security for Cloud Computing, 10 Steps to Ensure Success. You have the URL to that paper here at the bottom of the screen. And by the way, all the CSCC papers are available at the same URL with that resource-hub suffix to the URL listed here at the bottom. And that particular paper recommended 10 steps. I'm not going to go through them here because they are going to be basically the 10 steps that guide the following slides. Each of the following slides we're going to go through now represents one step, and we're going to talk about what are the applicable standards in each of these 10 steps, going from, looking at consideration of going into the cloud to potentially exiting the services of a particular cloud vendor, and everything in between. And there are standards that are applicable at each level and considerations about implementing them or requiring certification from your vendors. But we provided this here as a reference to remind you of the companion paper, and it's structured in 10 particular steps. So to start talking about these 10 steps, I'm going to hand this over to my colleague Alex Tumashov, who is going to start taking you through the first few steps. Alex.
And if I may, I'm sorry, Claude and Alex, it's Tracy again. I just wanted to mention in our attachments tab, I think a couple of our URLs were a bit long, so not everyone can access the URL. If you're getting a 404 message, you can find the deliverable and the PDF presentation if you go to our site. It's cloud-council/events. And I'm going to try to update both the links in the tab. But for now, you could go to cloud-council/events, and you'll see the entry for September 20th. So sorry about that. And here you go, Alex. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, Claude. So the first step is to ensure effective governance, risk, and compliance. This terminology is not new for all enterprises, right? Companies trying to look into these three pillars as a single entity to sustain their business within regulatory requirements and acceptable risk level. The difference between normal or legacy, if you will, environment and cloud environment is that now you have a third-party supplier partner who has to be a significant part of a new GRC model. Risk level and requirements will have a different value with different implementations, but they have to be assessed and addressed by a customer. Organizations that are able to actively demonstrate an effective governance, risk, and compliance framework can create a competitive environment. So to be able to sustain same GRC level in the cloud world, companies have to evaluate their GRC requirements against available industry standards and enforce them to be critical control for any new cloud implementation. Certification against standards that you see on the right side of this slide can be used during the assessment process. In some cases, those requirements could be a deal breaker, and in others, just a good to have validation of maturity level of a cloud service provider. But this will be driven by the company requirements in terms of regulations, risk tolerance level, general IT governance requirements, and other country and industry-specific requirements. For instance, ISO 20000 and ITIL will be a good source for IT service management guidelines. ISO 27001 and 2 would guideline for risk and security controls. COVID would help IT to stay connected to the business goals and requirements. PCI, HIPAA, FedRAMP, Privacy Shield will give a good understanding on data privacy regulations. Worth to mention that there are two standards that have been specifically designed for the cloud environment. ISO 27017 focus on cloud security, and ISO 27018 focus on PII data on the cloud. So the second step is related to the compliance assurance. And it's pretty clear that we need to validate that companies are state compliant with all certifications they have. So during the implementation and life cycle periods of cloud services, we have to make sure that cloud service provider is in compliance with all our mentioned early on the previous slide requirements. There are several industry standards which serve to prove an organization's ongoing commitment to quality and customer satisfaction in different aspects. Independent reviews and assessments shall be performed at least annually and available to the customers to ensure that the organization addresses nonconformities of established policies, standards, procedures, and compliance obligations. Most popular or well-accepted certifications, if you will, are ISO 27000 series and SOX or SSAE 16, with focus on providers who has a significant financial impact on their customers. Also, in white paper, we outline several services that may help customer to assure cloud service providers compliance in automated fashion. Another important step, another important step is to manage people, roles, and identities. The importance of identity and access management has dramatically increased in recent years with the cloud service offerings. Based on the data classification and risk level, you may want to enforce some additional controls to your cloud identity and access management processes. These controls will improve security from IT and user standpoint. By using federation, you can enforce your password policies and automate users' provisioning and deprovisioning processes. At the same time, you can help users to remember only one password for corporate applications. Moreover, single sign-on would authorize them without prompting passwords all the time they go to an application within trusted environment. In some cases, multi-factor authentication would be a strong requirement, especially for privileged accounts. There are several technologies that provide federation, single sign-on, and MFA capabilities like SAML, OAuth, OpenID, and etc. We have those technologies outlined in our paper. Customers have to review their security requirements and make sure that cloud provider can deliver these type of technologies, and you are able to consume those technologies. The next step of our framework addressing proper protection of data and information. All cloud services use data as an asset, which they operate to deliver services to a customer. At the same time, usually customer is a data owner, and hence he is responsible for all liability and regulations obligations. Moreover, data is the most valuable asset, which can affect customers' reputation and business. To mitigate this risk, legal obligations can be negotiated in agreement between cloud service provider and customer, and that would be under legal controls. But there are additional IT standard encryption technologies which would help to enforce data protection as well at rest as in transit. Data flow lifecycle has to be reviewed from the security standpoint using current control standards, and all necessary measures have to be implemented. For the encryption in transit, we can use HTTPS, SFTP, VPN under SSL and TLS. The most important point here in this part is that encryption doesn't mean protection. If you encrypt the data, it doesn't mean that you protect the data. The first you need to think about is that implemented encryption protocols and technologies are up to date. Increasing key ownership at the right place. Ensure proper identity and access management process. Always monitor and audit this process for non-compliances against current standards. Mike?
Thank you, Alex. So moving on to the next step in the sequence we have here, we look at enforcing the policies that apply to the protection of personal data, otherwise known as privacy for short. Now, this is an area that's an increasing focus for many organizations. There are all kinds of laws and regulations surrounding the collection and use of personal data. On the slide here, we have one of the latest contributions in that area, which is the European Union General Data Protection Regulation, and certainly for any organization that's dealing with the personal data of European Union citizens, and that's something you have to take very seriously. Now, the privacy requirements typically include limitations on the use and access to that personal data, who can access it, how they can access and what they do with it. There's a need to have any personal data appropriately tagged or marked so it can be identified straightforwardly. And, of course, any personal data you've got needs to be securely stored. Typically has to be encrypted, for example. And there needs to be careful control over which users are allowed access to the data. There needs to be fine-grained control, for example, over access to the data and control over which processing capabilities are allowed to be used. And there are whole sets of personal data that require very special treatment, often termed sensitive personal data, that includes things like health data and credit card information. And many of these pieces of data then also have specific regulations and standards that apply to them. So we have a couple of those noted here. The HIPAA regulations that apply to health data in the USA, and then the PCI DSS standard that applies to handling of credit card data pretty well worldwide.
Mike, excuse me for interrupting. Can you speak a little louder, please?
I'm being a bit quiet. My apologies. The privacy issues should be addressed in the cloud service agreement between the cloud service customer and the cloud service provider. There should be some specific terms that address how privacy is being handled, and a help in this will be the Cloud SLA standard, the ISO IEC 19086 standard. And then in general, the necessary controls that ought to be in place for any cloud service that's handling PII should be as defined in the ISO IEC 2718 standard that was created specifically for this. And it is one thing you should be looking for when acquiring a cloud service that is going to handle personal information, that the cloud service provider has a 2718 certification. There are now already quite a few cloud services available that have this certification, so it's worth looking out for. Moving on from personal data, the next step is to look at your applications and to look at the security provisions that you have in place for the applications you're putting into a cloud service. And this has to be over the complete life cycle. So that includes the development and deployment of the applications, the testing of the applications once they're deployed. Fortunately, there are some very useful standards and pieces of advice available that help you in this. For development and deployment, there is the OWASP project, which we've linked off this page, and also a standard called ISO 2734 that talks about the various measures that you should be taking in your application to provide the appropriate levels of security. And then for security testing, there is a NIST standard available, 800-115, that talks about how to go about appropriate testing of the security aspects of your application. And indeed, the OWASP project also has some good advice that applies to testing as well. That's detailed in the paper. We don't talk about it here on the slides. Of course, it's important to remember that what application security matters to you as a cloud service customer will depend on which model you're using for the cloud service. So if you're using infrastructure as a service, then you as the customer are probably responsible for the majority of security components relating to your application. All you're getting is a basic service of a server machine and some networking and so on. So you are responsible for installing and configuring the security components. For platform as a service, where large elements of the software stack that your application is going to use are going to be provided by the provider, then things are a little different. You would expect the provider to provide secure operating system, to provide secure middleware and a secure network, but the actual application security may be things like providing login and access control. That is still your responsibility. Meanwhile, for software as a service, where you're buying effectively an application off the shelf from the provider, then clearly most of the application security responsibilities are going to lie with the provider, although you as the customer may have options and configuration settings that you may have available to you, and you need to understand the effects of those. And you may still need to understand data encryption standards and the audit capabilities that are being supplied by the cloud service provider, and any SLAs that they are signing up to as well. Moving on, once we've looked at the application security, another major area of concern with cloud services is the security of cloud networks and the connections. And of course, you've got to make sure that those are secure too. Cloud computing almost always involves networks. Most of the time, they are external and running over the internet. So this is a big concern. And you need to be thinking about confidentiality of data that's being transmitted over those networks, integrity of the data, and it's tamper-proof, and that the networks are available. Because if the network's not available, neither is your application. And when dealing with external networks, dealing with the internet, then we should be thinking of things like traffic screening, intrusion detection and prevention, and logging and notification of anything that's coming in from the external network. But even where we have internal networks, say within the cloud data center, we need to think about the requirements there. Typically, public cloud services involve sharing of resources between multiple customers, and so those clients need to be protected from each other. You don't want different clients' network traffic interfering with each other. In addition, there's a need to make sure that the provider's network that's usually being used to manage the cloud services, that network is protected as well and is separated from any client traffic. Now, there are some useful standards that address network security. The ISO 27733 standard directly addresses network security. And also, we have the NIST 800-53 publication that has a very useful set of controls for networks. And the FedRAMP program, which is also publicly available, also specifies some very specific controls that need to be in place, used by federal government agencies in the USA, but applicable to any other cloud service user too. Now, having completed network security, I'd like to hand over to Claude to complete the remaining steps. Thank you, Claude.
All right, thank you, Mike. And as everyone must have discovered by listening to Mike, I mean, this is sort of the expert in our field of everything that's going on in the standards community, including ISO. I mean, we're constantly being guided by Mike in our discussions about what's going on there. So we're so happy to have that level of expertise about that. So I'm going to resume here with the step 8, and then go through the end of this. There's of course an aspect of cloud security that simply is inherited from normal IT security, which is about physical infrastructure and securities. You can't have a secure infrastructure in terms of data protection and network protection if you don't physically control the access to the physical facilities, the computer centers, the location of the routers, etc., etc. So this is not new, but it's rendered more complicated by the fact that now you have access to the cloud from different endpoints. You have the endpoint inside your own facility, which might be subjected to intruders or even illegitimate access by some of your own employees who shouldn't be in the computer facility, and you don't know what's going on at the other end, at the cloud end. So it is important there that the provider apply the right rules, which are contained partially in ISO 27002, which are security controls, but as a significant section related to protecting the physical plant. And there's also an ANSI TIA 942 standard that applies there. So this has to do with the actual physical securing of the infrastructure, securing it against threats like interruptions due to weather, fires, etc. Controlling who has access. So are people properly badged? Do they have to enter codes or even two-factor authentication systems that might include fingerprints, or in highly sensitive cases, retinal scans, etc., in order to enter the areas? Is there a control that two people cannot enter at one time with just one person having authenticated? So you have certain facilities where there is a sort of a double door system where only one person can fit between the two doors to enter, and then there's controls over actually accessing the equipment even once you are inside the room, or accessing routers and cables within the rest of the facility. Control over accessing certain utilities that give you a way to intervene into the network, maintaining the equipment, upgrading the equipment correctly, removing and disposing of CDs and thumb drives and printouts that may contain confidential information, vetting correctly your employees, that's under human resource security, and having disaster recovery and business continuity plans in place. So these two standards, with the ability for your cloud provider to get certified as compliant with the 27002 standard, or applying the ANSI physical security standards, can provide you, the customer, assurance that physical security at the provider end is as good or better as the security you may have for your own facilities, and therefore provide protection against physical access of any of the elements of the cloud. Moving on to step 9, you now have the impact of security on the cloud service agreement. So one of the key or the set of documents that you as a customer sign when you agree to buy the service from the provider, including the acceptable use policy, including what basically serves as a legal contract, and including the service level agreements, or SLAs, all that together constitutes what is called the cloud service agreement. And the CSCC has a couple of other papers about cloud service agreements, what they should contain and what you should verify in them. And I recommend that you download those papers from the Resource Hub. There's two specific ones about cloud service agreements. And the considerations in there are very general about any aspect of cloud service, just like you would want to verify what the provider commits to in terms of reliability, availability, response to incidents, etc., and performance. The CSA is also going to contain terms about what the provider commits to do in terms of security. The main things that you need to watch for here and potentially negotiate a better CSA is what is the notification that the provider gives you in case there was an attack or a breach or an incident. It's not consistent, or it's not always the case, that the provider accepts to proactively notify you, the customer, when there was an incident. And we think at the CSCC that this is something that needs to improve. This is something you need to insist on. And then they should also tell you, okay, in case there is an incident and it causes the service to be stopped, or it potentially causes data to be exposed to an intruder, what will the provider do to recover, to close the breach, and to potentially make you whole? Restore your data, tell you exactly what potentially was accessed and what was not, so that you can take appropriate measures, and how do they compensate you for the potential loss of service during that time. Some providers, of course, subcontract some aspects of their service, especially the communications, potentially the help desk, to third parties. So does the CSA cover their subcontractors, or does it say, well, the subcontractors have their own terms, we're not responsible for that? You don't want to interact directly with the subcontractors, so you need the CSA to cover them. And then what are the metrics that are included in there for the performance and the effectiveness of the controls on information security management? And that's where the ISO standards 27004 and the brand new or just emerging 19086, the NIST publication 800-55, and the CIS consensus metrics are important. For data protection, of course, we've already mentioned 27018, and then you basically will want to obtain compliance reports. So if the provider gets assessed regularly, maybe on an annual or semi-annual basis against certain of these standards by independent certified auditors, you want to have access to the reports on that compliance. And so there is a long list here on the right-hand side. Don't be too daunted by that list. Not everything is necessarily applicable. This is more of a menu of things that people can apply, and it will be up to you, the customer, to judge whether one of these standards is sufficient, or two or three. I will mention here the common weakness enumeration, CWE, fourth from the top of this, the right-hand side of this slide. This is specifically about applying secure coding practices, and if you use a SaaS system in particular, you want to make sure that there's been obedience to the common weakness enumeration guidelines by the people who program the application, so that it doesn't expose your data through things like SQL injection and buffer overflow, which are still all too common. All right, so we come finally to step 10, which is relatively simple. This is about exiting, i.e. you chose to quit a provider and go and sign up with another one. And now this involves a certain number of additional security issues. You want the right to be forgotten, essentially. You want the right for all your data that was resident within the premises of your ex-provider to be erased once you're sure that you have it all and that you don't need to have access to anything. And that gets complicated because providers may have their own backup mechanisms. They may have copies of your data, and you need to make sure that they guarantee that they're going to erase everything, including log data, audit data that may contain your own confidential information. And so you want the process to be smooth. You don't want to lose data, but you also don't want any data to be left behind that provider with whom you severed relationships would potentially keep, not necessarily out of malice, but simply out of the way they do their own data backups, etc. So there's language about this exit process in the 19086 standard, which is in the process of coming out. So it's important to verify that this is covered too. So the way you would essentially implement some of these decisions on which standards matter to you and which ones you like your cloud provider to adopt is by insisting on certifications. A provider should have certifications against a certain number of standards, especially the ISO ones, where you have certified auditors or certified assessors that can provide a neutral assessment report. So it is typically a third-party auditor who works for an organization that has been accredited by a standards body, national or international, as being qualified to examine the practices of the provider and say yes or no, this provider complies with the standard. So it's essentially the ISO ones 27001 and 27018 on privacy that are relevant here, as well as the trustee privacy safe harbor rules. And that's where you want to have this certification provided to you by the CSP, the cloud service provider, and on a periodic basis. You need to look at the validity date of the certification, and you need to make a note on your calendar that before that date arrives, you're asking the provider to supply a renewed or a certificate with a new validity date. It's all too easy to forget it, and then people can slip and progressively abandon the rigor of the rigor of their practices. And when I mentioned then ANSI TIA 942 on the previous slide, by the way, this is not something that people hear about that much, but that is something that some customers actually require. There is an example where IBM got a request by a customer to verify that they were compliant with TIA 942 for one of their data centers. So this is not something we're raising just like that. It's there are people out there who know about it and require it, and this may be quite relevant to you in terms of certifications. All right, so we've not only reached step 10, but we've summarized what are the certifications that you may want to require as a customer, and that's the way to implement this. So in terms of final recommendations, you need to expect and to some extent demand or negotiate better compliance if it's not clear from the documents you're being proposed during the negotiation that your cloud service provider will support a certain number of suitable standards. They don't have to support necessarily all of them, but a complement of standards that meets your needs, either general governance standards about IT or generic security standards about IT that, of course, apply to the cloud, that there may be some form of federated identities or single sign-on so that you can easily extend the access control of your employees to the cloud without having to have a proliferation of IDs and passwords, that data is secured in motion, that when your data is being transferred from your user screen inside your offices to the cloud application at the other end of the country, that data is encrypted, or placed in virtual private networks that are not easily sniffable in transit. That static data is encrypted if necessary. So there's FIPS recommendations and key management interface protocols to manage the key exchange securely in order to have access to the static data that is stored at the cloud provider, and then that the network itself is secured using the applicable ISO or NIST recommendations for network security. And then you want to have, at minimum, compliance or evidence of certifications against a certain suite of ISO standards, specifically 27001, 17, and 18, or equivalent, and that the provider refreshes those certifications on the appropriate frequency. So, in conclusion, we obviously invite you to continue to help us with that work. By joining the CSCC, you get to participate, you get to influence the priorities of the work we do, you get to input your own knowledge of what regulations are necessary, what are your own concerns, our customers, what are your own practices if you're a cloud service provider yourself, and the membership is free. There is an online registration form at the URL shown on that slide. You can also just go to the main page, and the link will be pretty obvious in the menu bar. And then we have a certain number of working groups. We have a practical guide working group, which continues to evolve these documents. We have groups on security, on health, on finance, on social media, etc. And this is the place to go and help with the work of elaborating our guidance. And then we have this rich set of guides that Tracy described at the beginning. They're all downloadable for free from the Resource Hub. We like you to go and serve yourself or on that at that URL instead of us forwarding documents by email, because that way we get to count how many downloads we have, and that tells us precious information about which our documents are the most useful to the public. So please consider joining. Thank you. And I'm going to let Tracy tell us what questions we have, and we're going to take those questions in the 12 minutes we have left.
Great. Thank you, Claude and Mike and Alex. I just wanted to leave this screen up because we were having a little trouble with our attachments. If you're looking for this deliverable in its entirety, the Cloud Security Standards Guide, you can get to it from the last link on this chart, the Resource Hub link. It's posted there up at the top under recently published deliverables. You'll find it. And also on our site there's an events section. It's just cloud-council.org/events. And on the events page there's a listing for September 20th. If you click on it, it not only will have a link to the deliverable I just described, it'll have a link to the PDF of today's webinar presentation as well. And you can go back to that page later on in the future if you'd like to, watch this on demand. The presentation will run on demand on Bright Talk for many months, and we also put it up on the Cloud Council's YouTube channel. So go back to our site if you're looking for the paper and the presentation. Sorry about the links and attachments. But now's a great time for questions. I do have a couple, but if you want to enter some, we should be able to get to them. First question for the team here, anyone can jump in. Most software as a service providers, SaaS providers, don't have these security certifications just yet. How do you advise we handle this with providers?
I'll take that for a second, then Mike and Alex can jump in. If they don't have a certification, well, first of all, what I would do is I would look them seriously in the eye and say, guys, you need to think about doing that. You need to think of having a simple way to prove to people that you're compliant. And in particular for SaaS providers, I would I would be very curious about their coding practices and whether they have any good education and verification of the fact that their software isn't full of holes, because we've been discussing these issues for 25 years and we still haven't all solved them. So that's important. But you can make your own checklist from the standards, and you can sit down during at some point in the discussion with the provider, or you need to say, I need to interview you about your security practices to get a reasonable level of assurance that your practices are secure. And I have a list of 25 questions here, which I derived from the applicable standards, and it would be a lot less painful if you had a certification, but since you don't, bring me the right person, or let's have a conference call with the right person inside your company, and I'm going to ask you those questions, and you're going to answer them, and basically I'm going to hold you to be responsible for your answers, and be aware that if one of your competitors, whom I'm also interviewing, has a certification, then they're going to be more credible than you are, and then you see if the answers are reasonable. So there's no magic there, but the standards fortunately give you enough guidance that you can try to apply those criteria yourself. It's just laborious or tedious compared to what would happen if they had a certification. Mike, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the way it seems to be going in the cloud computing market at the moment is that certifications are coming from the ground up. People have started by getting certifications for the infrastructure as a service and platform as a service offerings first, and only then going on to do the software as a service. And I suppose in some ways it's understandable, since clearly the infrastructure on which the applications are going to work have to be certified first. I think that may be one of the pieces of the dynamic that's going on here.
Okay, Mike, if you have to talk again, you are becoming very faint again. Sorry about that. Okay, go ahead, Tracy.
Okay, next question. Asking if we could talk a bit about the validity of the self-assessment of security standards. So self-assessment versus, external certification. If we have any thoughts there.
Well, I'm sure Mike does.
My own preference is always for official external certification of any standard with appropriate auditors. But I do know that there are some schemes, like the CSA Star Matrix, where they do provide for self-certification processes. And certainly for some of the smaller providers, you might envisage that it can be an expensive process to use external auditors. And maybe for some small providers, the self-certification is a reasonable approach to avoid increasing costs too much. That doesn't seem to me to apply to the big providers, though. They should be able to afford the external auditors, and indeed, quite a number of the large providers do have certifications done by external auditors for their cloud services. I don't know what Alex or Claude, your views are.
This is Alex. What I would
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, well, what I would suggest from my side, in this case, you have to come up with the critical control metrics for all requirements you have to this cloud service provider, and make sure that this cloud service provider sign off all the statements that will go maybe in the master service agreement. So if cloud service provider doesn't give you a confidence of compliance, then probably you need to ask him to sign off on this compliance on the paper, right? So there's a good way to assure that they will try to work in compliance within your security requirements.
Thanks, Alex. We've got some great comments from people, thanking us for having such comprehensive material. And I just want to remind you, too, that this is just a snapshot. And for a deeper dive go ahead and download the whole white paper. It's significant in size. I don't know, Claude, maybe it's 30 pages or so. It's in our resource hub there for you. It's free download. Another question here. If I have operations outside of the U.S. and Europe, what should I be looking at?
Well, I mean, okay, so I think I'll turn it over to Alex in a second because he's with a company that works in 100 different countries. You have to look at what are the regulations locally that you may be subject to, and if you had a cloud provider that did not implement such or such security control, that would put you at a risk of violating a local regulation. And that's regardless of which country you work on. Obviously, we here are people located in the U.S. and in Europe. A lot of our members are in the U.S., Canada, and Europe, and we don't claim to know what are the applicable regulations in the entire world. So you're going to have to do a little bit of that investigation yourself. And again, the main risk is that your cloud provider, by not implementing a certain measure, could put you at risk of inadvertently violating a local regulation. Alex, any thoughts?
Yeah, so 3 topics to be addressed here, and actually here the IT has to work closely with the legal departments, right, to identify the risk there. So 3 topics. The first one is data residency, because of some countries you have any specific requirements for the data that it has to stay within the country borders, right? Second one is trade compliance and customs, where you cannot export some intellectual property and some data out of your country or to the specific countries that are under sanctions or embargo countries. And the third one is PII or personal data, which may have any specific applicable only to these country requirements. Those 3 has to be reviewed by the legal representative within this country, and he has to communicate all necessary requirements as per these data. That's pretty much it from this topic. So as soon as you prepare and you go to the cloud services, just include these 3 assessments in your process that any cloud services has to go through if you operate within several countries, for sure.
Do you have any thoughts, Mike? Looks like we're all wrapped up with questions.
Yeah, the problem of dealing with regulations and laws around the world is a tricky one, and there's no alternative. But if you're operating in a particular country, you have to find out what applies to that particular country, and it's a complete patchwork quilt of different rules and regulations around the world, and particularly for personal data, it's a minefield. You have to watch out very carefully what you're doing.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you, Claude, Mike, and Alex for presenting. We hope you'll join us for future events. Sign up on our site to receive emails. Subscribe to our Bright Talk channel. We have a good handful of other presentations up there that you can watch at any time. And have a good rest of the day. We'll see you then. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.